The banker arrived before sunrise. Horse hooves broke the silence, cracking through the frozen mud of the yard. Evelyn was already dressed. She hadn't slept well in months. The sound of approaching riders in the dark still made her hands shake. She forced herself to stop. She pulled on her coat and stepped onto the porch. She stood there before they could even knock. Harlan Briggs sat on his gray horse, flanked by two men. They were hired muscle, wearing the particular look of men who enjoyed their work. The sky was the color of a bruise. The red canyon walls caught the pale light, looking like something bleeding. "Mrs. Ross," Briggs said, without lifting his hat. "I believe you received my letter." Evelyn stepped down from the porch. Her voice was steady. She had practiced that. "I received it," she said. "The answer is no." Briggs pulled a folded paper from his coat. "That answer is not yours to give," he said. "The note on this property came due November 1st. It is now February. The bank has been patient." "The bank has been circling," Evelyn replied, her voice cold. The other moved his horse toward the cattle pen, and that was when Evelyn stepped directly into his path. "Get away from my animals." The man looked down at her with contempt. He'd never once been told no by a woman, and he didn't intend to start now. He was twice her size. She knew it. He knew it. Everyone in the yard knew it. "Ma'am," he said, "you might want to step aside." "I might not." Her hands were trembling inside her coat pockets. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held her ground. Briggs sighed with theatrical patience. "Mrs. Ross, I have a legal document. I have 2 witnesses. I have every right under the law of this territory to begin inventory of assets against the outstanding debt. Now you can make this difficult, or you can." She said no. The voice came from the edge of the yard, low and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. Evelyn did not turn around immediately. She watched Briggs's face instead, and she saw something move through it. Not fear exactly. Something more careful than fear. Jericho Cross walked out of the shadow of the canyon wall as though he had been part of it. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had seen a decade of hard winters. He carried a rifle across his back and moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion was a form of weakness. He did not look at Evelyn. He looked at Briggs. He crossed the yard without hurrying, reached the fence post beside the cattle pen, and set a leather pouch on the flat top of the post. The sound it made was heavy and deliberate. "That covers the note," Jericho said. "Principal and interest both." Briggs stared at the pouch. "Mr. Cross, this is not your affair. I'm making it mine." Jericho's voice did not change. "Count it if you want. It's all there." A long silence settled over the yard. One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. The other had gone very still, the way men go still when they realize the situation has changed, and they are not sure yet how it has changed. Briggs looked at Jericho for a long moment. Then he looked at the pouch. Then he looked at Evelyn, and whatever he saw in her face did not give him what he was looking for. He reached out and took the pouch. "This settles the current debt," Briggs said carefully. "It does not settle the question of whether this farm is viable long-term." "That question," Jericho said, "is not yours to ask." Briggs turned his horse. His men followed. They rode out of the yard without another word, and the sound of hooves faded into the canyon until there was nothing left but the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Evelyn stood very still. She heard Jericho's boots on the frozen ground as he walked to the fence and checked the latch on the cattle pen. He did not look at her. He checked the latch, found it sound, and then stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the canyon. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I don't know when I can repay you. I didn't ask." She wanted to argue. She had been arguing with people her entire life, with her father about propriety, with her husband's commanding officers about his deployment, with the lawyers after the funeral, with every person who had looked at her and seen a problem to be managed rather than a woman to be reckoned with. She was very good at arguing. But something about the way Jericho Cross stood there, quiet and solid as the canyon wall behind him, made the argument die before it reached her lips. "Who are you?" she asked instead. He turned then, and she saw his face properly for the first time. He was older than she had initially thought, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of weathering that came from years outdoors rather than years of age. His eyes were dark and direct, and they held the particular quality of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. "Jericho Cross," he said. "I have the cabin up on the North Ridge. Your uncle and I had an arrangement." He let me hunt the Eastern Canyon in exchange for keeping an eye on the property. My uncle has been dead for 8 months. I know. He picked up his rifle from where he had leaned it against the fence. Arrangement still stands, far as I'm concerned. He walked back toward the canyon wall, and within a few steps the shadow seemed to absorb him entirely, until she could not be certain he had been there at all. The town of Red Rock sat at the mouth of the canyon, like something the landscape had reluctantly agreed to tolerate. It had a general store, a church, a saloon, a livery, and the particular social architecture of a small community that had been watching itself for so long it had forgotten how to look at anything else. Evelyn had arrived in October, and by November she understood that the town had already decided what to make of her. A war widow from back east, no children, no family, trying to run a cattle operation she had no business running. The women at the church social were polite in the way that people are polite when they are waiting for you to fail. The men at the general store were helpful in the way that men are helpful when they expect something in return. She had learned to do her shopping quickly, and her socializing not at all. The morning after Briggs's visit, she drove her wagon into town for feed, and found herself the subject of a conversation that stopped the moment she walked through the door of Henderson's store. 3 women stood near the dry goods counter. Martha Alcott, who ran the boarding house, Dora Finch, whose husband owned the livery, and a younger woman Evelyn did not know, who had the look of someone who had recently arrived and was still deciding what kind of person to be. "Mrs. Ross," Martha said, with the particular warmth of someone who has just been talking about you. "We heard about your trouble this morning." "It's resolved," Evelyn said. "Jericho Cross paid your debt." Dora said it the way people say things they want confirmed, not the way they say things they already know. "He did." The 3 women exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. "That's unusual," Martha said carefully. "Jericho doesn't involve himself in town matters. He doesn't involve himself in much of anything. He had an arrangement with my uncle." "Your uncle has been dead for 8 months, Dora said. "So I've been told." Evelyn took her list to the counter and began placing her order. She could feel the women watching her, feel the weight of their speculations settling around her like snow. She had grown up in a small town. She knew exactly what was being thought, what would be said over supper tables that evening, what conclusions were already being drawn. She did not care. Or rather, she had decided not to care, which was a different thing entirely and considerably harder. The young woman she didn't know appeared at her elbow. "I'm Clara Webb," she said quietly. "I arrived in September. I know what it's like to be the new subject of conversation." Evelyn looked at her. Clara had an honest face and the slightly battered look of someone who had recently survived something. "Evelyn Ross," she said. "I know." Clara smiled slightly. "Everyone knows. That's the thing about Red Rock. Everyone knows everything, usually before it happens." The cattle sickness came in March. It started with 2 animals, a listlessness, a refusal to eat, a particular quality of stillness that Evelyn recognized from her mother's herb books as something serious. By the 2nd day, 4 more showed the same signs. By the 3rd day, she had lost 1 animal and was watching 3 others with the particular dread of someone who knows the math and does not like the answer. She drove to town for the doctor, who told her he treated people, not livestock. She drove to the next farm over, where old Garrett Hicks told her it sounded like blackleg and there was nothing to be done. She drove back to her farm in the gray afternoon light and stood in the cattle pen and thought about her uncle's herb books, which she had found in a trunk in the back room and read 3 times over the winter because there was nothing else to do on the long dark evenings. She was mixing a poultice at the kitchen table when she heard boots on the porch. Jericho Cross stood in the doorway, looking at the collection of dried herbs and the open book and the bowl in her hands. "Blackleg?" he asked. "I think so. I'm trying a treatment my uncle's books describe. Garlic and yarrow in a strong tea, administered directly. It may not work." He looked at the book. "May I?" She handed it to him. He read for a moment, then set it down and looked at her preparations. "You'll need more yarrow than that," he said. "And the garlic wants to be crushed, not chopped. Changes the properties." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "My mother was a healer." He said it simply, without elaboration, and moved to the table. "I'll help." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, moving between the kitchen and the cattle pen in a rhythm that required very little conversation. Jericho knew things she did not know, practical things, the way to hold an animal still without frightening it further, the precise temperature the tea needed to be, the signs that indicated whether the treatment was taking hold. He worked without commentary or instruction, simply doing what needed doing, and Evelyn found herself matching his pace without thinking about it. By midnight, 2 of the 3 sick animals were showing improvement. They sat on the fence rail in the cold, watching the cattle. The canyon walls rose black against a sky full of stars, and the only sound was the occasional movement of animals and the distant cry of something wild in the upper reaches. "You've done this before," Evelyn said. "Helped with sick cattle? Stayed up all night watching over something?" A pause. Yes. She did not ask what. She had her own nights like that, her own particular inventory of things she had watched over and lost and carried forward. She suspected he understood that without being told. "The town thinks it's strange," she said, "that you helped me with Briggs. The town thinks a lot of things. They think there's something between us." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a problem?" She considered the question honestly. 6 months ago it would have been. 6 months ago, she had been so raw with grief and displacement that the idea of anyone's attention felt like an intrusion. But something had shifted over the winter, some slow recalibration she had not noticed happening until it was already done. "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded, as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer, and they sat in silence until the sky began to lighten in the east. The town noticed. It noticed the way small towns notice everything, with the particular thoroughness of people who have very little else to occupy their attention. It noticed that Jericho Cross had come down from his ridge more in the past 2 months than in the previous 2 years. It noticed that his horse was sometimes tied outside the Ross farm in the evenings. It noticed that Evelyn Ross, who had arrived in October looking like a woman waiting to be defeated, was walking through town in March with a different quality of steadiness. Martha Alcott mentioned it at the church social. Dora Finch mentioned it at the livery. The men at the saloon mentioned it in the particular way men mention things they find both interesting and slightly threatening, because Jericho Cross was not a man anyone in Red Rock had ever been entirely comfortable with. He had arrived in the valley 4 years ago, alone, and built his cabin on the North Ridge without asking anyone's permission or opinion. He hunted, he traded furs, he came to town when he needed supplies and left without socializing. He had broken up 2 fights at the saloon without apparent effort and without apparent anger, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had been angry. He had once tracked a man who had stolen horses from 3 different farms, found him 2 days into the canyon, and brought him back without explanation or visible emotion. People in Red Rock were not afraid of Jericho Cross exactly. They were careful around him, the way you are careful around something that has never hurt you, but that you understand could. The idea that this man had attached himself to the widow Ross was the most interesting thing that had happened in Red Rock in years, and the town was going to get every possible unit of conversation out of it. The blizzard came in late March without much warning. Evelyn had seen the sky changing in the afternoon, the particular yellow-gray quality that meant serious weather, and she had spent the remaining daylight hours securing the cattle pen and bringing in extra wood. By the time full dark fell, the wind was screaming through the canyon and the snow was coming sideways. She sat by the stove with her uncle's books and tried not to think about the sounds the wind made. It was not the wind itself that bothered her. It was what the wind sounded like, the particular pitch of it in the canyon, which was too close to other sounds she carried in her memory. Artillery. The way her husband had described it in his letters. The way she had imagined it in the months before the letter came that said he was not coming home. She had gotten better at this. She knew she had. But some nights the sounds were louder than her progress. She did not hear Jericho arrive over the wind. She simply looked up at some point and saw firelight through the window, a small steady glow on the far side of the yard, sheltered against the barn wall. She put on her coat and went to the door. He was sitting on an upturned crate with a fire built in a ring of stones, close enough to the barn to be out of the worst of the wind. He had a blanket around his shoulders and his rifle across his knees, and he was looking out at the canyon with the patient stillness of someone who had nowhere else to be. "You're going to freeze," she said. "I've been colder. Come inside." He looked at her for a moment. "That would cause talk." "There's already talk." "More talk then." She stood in the doorway with the wind pulling at her coat. "Jericho, come inside." He came inside. He sat by the stove and she made coffee and they did not talk much, but the quality of the silence was different from the silence of the wind. It was a chosen silence, a comfortable one, the kind that exists between people who have stopped needing to fill space with words. At some point she fell asleep in the chair. When she woke, the storm had quieted and gray morning light was coming through the window. Jericho was still there, sitting upright in the other chair, awake, watching the door with the particular alertness of someone who had been watching it all night. On the table beside her was a cup of coffee still warm. She looked at it, then at him. He said nothing. He simply stood, picked up his rifle, and went to check on the cattle. She lost a sheep in the storm. She discovered it when she went to count the flock in the morning, and the count came up short, and she walked the fence line twice to be sure. One ewe gone. The snow was deep, and the canyon was vast, and the sensible thing was to accept the loss. She was not good at accepting losses. She told Jericho, when he came back from the cattle pen. He listened without interrupting, then looked at the canyon for a moment. Which direction does she usually drift when she's spooked? East. Toward the lower canyon. He nodded. I'll find her. I'm coming with you. He looked at her. She looked back. The snow is deep, he said. I know. It'll be slow going. I know that too. Another pause. All right. They went into the canyon together, following the fence line east, and then dropping into the lower reaches where the red rock walls narrowed and the snow had drifted into strange shapes. Jericho moved through it with the efficiency of long practice, reading the landscape in ways Evelyn was only beginning to understand. He pointed out tracks she would have missed, noted the way the wind had moved the snow, made small adjustments to their direction that seemed arbitrary until they proved correct. They found the ewe 2 hours in, wedged into a rock shelter in the lower canyon wall, cold and frightened but alive. Getting her out was harder than finding her. The snow around the shelter was chest deep in places, and the ewe was not cooperative. Evelyn went in after her while Jericho held the rope, and she was halfway back out when she went through a snow crust into a drift that came up to her shoulders. She was not in danger. She knew she was not in danger. But the sudden cold and the sudden darkness of the snow around her, and the way the canyon walls seemed to close and triggered something she could not entirely control, and for a moment she could not move. Then Jericho's hand closed around her arm. He pulled her out of the drift in one steady motion, and she came up gasping, and he did not let go. He pulled her against him and wrapped his coat around both of them, and she could feel the solid reality of him, the warmth and the weight and the absolute steadiness, and the thing that had seized her chest slowly released. I'm all right, she said. I know. He did not move. She stood there for a moment, breathing. The canyon was very quiet. The ewe was making small, unhappy sounds behind them. I have moments, she said. Since the war. Since Thomas died. I have moments where things close in. I know that too, he said quietly. She looked up at him. His face was very close, and she could see in it something she had not expected, not pity, not discomfort, but recognition. The particular recognition of someone who understood from the inside. You have them too, she said. Had them worse, he said. Still have them sometimes. They get smaller. She nodded. She believed him. They got the ewe out and walked back to the farm in the afternoon light, the canyon walls glowing red around them, and Evelyn thought that she had not felt this particular quality of not alone in a very long time. The spring fair came in May. Red Rock held it every year in the field behind the church, with tables of food and goods, and the particular social intensity of a community that had been cooped up through a hard winter and was ready to be seen. Evelyn went because Clara Webb had asked her to share a table for her sewing work, and because she had decided months ago that she was not going to let the town's opinion of her determine where she went. She had been there an hour when Wade Coulter arrived. Coulter was a rancher from the south end of the valley, a broad man with a loud voice and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He had made an offer on Evelyn's farm in November, a low offer, delivered with the implication that she would eventually come to her senses and accept it. She had declined. He had made the offer again in January. She had declined again. He had not taken it well either time. He came to her table with two of his ranch hands behind him and the particular smile of someone who has decided to make a point in public. Mrs. Ross, he said, heard you had some trouble with the bank this winter. It was resolved, Evelyn said. Heard Jericho Cross resolved it for you. He said it with a particular emphasis, letting the implication hang in the air between them. Around them, conversations had begun to quiet. People were listening. Interesting arrangement. It was alone between neighbors, Evelyn said. Nothing interesting about it. Some people might find it interesting. Coulter leaned on the table. A widow woman, alone on a farm, taking money from a man like Cross. People talk. People do, Evelyn agreed. Usually about things that aren't their business. Coulter's smile thinned. I'm just saying, Mrs. Ross, that a woman in your position might want to think carefully about her reputation. Might want to think about whether she's making the right choices, whether she's really suited to running a farm on her own, or whether she'd be better off. Better off what? The voice came from behind Coulter. Not loud, not threatening, simply present, the way a stone wall is present. Coulter turned. Jericho Cross stood at the edge of the table, and he had not drawn his gun, had not raised his voice, had not done anything that could be called threatening. He had simply arrived, and the quality of his arrival was enough. His eyes were on Coulter with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the other person to catch up. The two ranch hands behind Coulter looked at each other. Jericho walked to the table. He reached past Coulter without acknowledging him, picked up the heavy crate of fabric samples that Evelyn had been meaning to move all morning, and set it on the other side of the table where it needed to go. Then he stood beside Evelyn, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her, and looked at Coulter with an expression of mild patience. The silence stretched. Around them, the fair had gone very quiet. Evelyn could feel the attention of the entire gathering, every eye in the field, the held breath of a community watching something happen. Coulter looked at Jericho. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the people watching. He left. His ranch hands followed him, and the crowd exhaled, and Clara Webb appeared at Evelyn's elbow with a cup of cider, and the expression of someone who had just witnessed something they would be describing for years. "Well," Clara said. "Well," Evelyn agreed. She looked at Jericho. He was already turning back to the table, examining the display of sewing work with the focused attention of someone who had decided the previous moment was finished, and this moment was what mattered. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I moved a crate," he said. "You know what I mean." He looked at her then, and something in his face was different from its usual careful stillness. Something had come to the surface that he had not entirely intended to show. "Yes," he said. "I know what you mean." The evening after the fair, Evelyn sat on her porch and watched the canyon turn red in the last light. The cattle were settled. The sheep were counted. The farm was quiet in the particular way it was quiet now, not the anxious quiet of her first months here, but something more settled. She heard his horse on the trail before she saw him, and she did not go inside. Jericho tied his horse at the fence and came to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps. He had his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. He was always so certain in his movements, so economical, and the hat in his hands was the first uncertain thing she had ever seen him do. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I'm not good at saying things. I've noticed." He looked at the canyon for a moment. "I came to this valley because I needed somewhere quiet. After the war. After some other things. I needed somewhere I could be still." He paused. "I didn't expect to find anything here worth staying for. Beyond the quiet." Evelyn waited. "Your uncle was a good man," Jericho said. "He didn't ask questions. He let me hunt his land, and he didn't need me to explain myself. When he died, I kept the arrangement because it was the right thing to do." He looked at her. "And then you came." "And then I came," she said. "You were counting pennies in the snow," he said. "The first time I saw you. You didn't know I was watching. You were counting the feed money, and you were short, and you just stood there for a moment, and then you straightened up and went back to work." He stopped. "I've seen a lot of people face hard things. Most of them either break or they get hard. You did neither." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. "I'm not asking for anything," Jericho said carefully. "I know what I am. I know what people think of me. I know I'm not easy company, and I'm not good at the things that make a life comfortable. But I want you to know that whatever you need, whatever this farm needs, I'm here. Not because of your uncle's arrangement. Because of you." The canyon was very red in the last light. A hawk was circling somewhere above the upper walls, a slow, patient circle, and the evening star had appeared in the east. Evelyn stood up from her chair. She walked down the porch steps and stood in front of him, and she looked at his face, the weathering and the steadiness and the thing he was trying not to show, and she thought about all the ways she had been alone in the past 2 years and all the ways she had not been alone this winter. "Jericho," she said, "I have been trying very hard not to need anyone. I know. I'm not sure I'm succeeding. I know that too." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, careful and certain, the way he did everything. "Stay for supper," she said. He stayed. Summer came to Red Rock Canyon like a slow exhale, the snow retreating up the walls until only the highest peaks held white, the canyon floor greening in ways Evelyn had not expected, wildflowers appearing in cracks in the red rock that seemed too dry and too hard to support anything living. She learned that the canyon was full of things that survived by being harder than they looked. The farm turned a corner in June. The cattle were healthy, the herd larger than it had been when she arrived, and the reputation she had built through the winter, the woman who had treated the blackleg, who had stood down Harlan Briggs, who had weathered the blizzard and come out the other side, had settled into something the town had decided to respect. Martha Alcott stopped by one afternoon with a pie and the particular manner of someone making a social correction. "We weren't very welcoming when you arrived," Martha said, sitting at Evelyn's kitchen table with her hands folded. "I want to say that plainly." "You were polite," Evelyn said. "Polite isn't the same as welcoming." Martha looked at her directly. "You've proven yourself, Mrs. Ross. More than proven yourself. And I think most of the town would say the same." Evelyn poured the coffee. "I wasn't trying to prove anything." "I know. That's part of why it worked." After Martha left, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the canyon. She could see Jericho on the upper trail, moving along the fence line with the easy purpose that was characteristic of him, checking things, fixing things, the constant quiet maintenance that kept a farm running. He had not moved into the farmhouse. He had not asked to. He came every day and he stayed most evenings, and sometimes he stayed through the night when the weather was bad or when she had one of her difficult nights, sleeping in the chair by the stove with his rifle across his knees. They had not talked about what they were to each other in any formal way. They did not need to. The town had decided for them, and for once the town's decision matched the truth. Clara Webb came by in July with news that she was leaving Red Rock, heading north to Oregon with a man she had met at the spring fair. "I'm happy for you," Evelyn said, and meant it. "Are you happy?" Clara asked, with the directness that had made Evelyn like her from the beginning. Evelyn thought about it honestly. "I think I'm becoming happy," she said. "I think that's different from being happy, and I think it might be better." Clara hugged her and rode away north, and Evelyn watched her go and felt the particular bittersweet quality of watching someone else's beginning. On an evening in late August, Evelyn came out of the house with 2 cups of tea and found Jericho on the porch steps, working on a piece of harness leather with the focused patience he brought to everything. The canyon was cooling toward evening, the red walls going deeper and darker, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern rim. She sat beside him and handed him the cup. He set down the harness and took it, and they sat in the quiet that had become the most comfortable thing in her life. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what you said. In the spring. About needing somewhere quiet." He looked at her. "I think I needed somewhere quiet too," she said. "I didn't know that when I came here. I thought I needed to prove something, to survive something, to get through something. But I think what I actually needed was somewhere still enough that I could hear myself again." Jericho was quiet for a moment. "Did you find it?" "I found something better," she said. "I found somewhere still enough that I didn't have to hear myself alone." He set down his cup. He reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his head against hers. And they sat like that while the canyon went dark around them and the stars came out one by one above the red rock walls. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no declaration, no grand gesture, no audience to witness it. It was simply 2 people who had been alone for a long time, sitting together in the quiet, and finding that the quiet was no longer empty. The cattle moved in the pen below. The creek ran somewhere in the darkness. The canyon held them both, red and ancient and indifferent to human trouble, and they sat in it together until the night was fully dark and the fire needed tending, and then they went inside.